the 17th century in Holland was a period where the country grew up. The wealth came from all over the world, and it must have been really staggering and surprising for everybody.
People wanted to express their wealth, and there was an enormous amount of prosperity here.
There is a love for art in the Netherlands, and it grows and grows.
Something was moving and shaking here. There was a lot of artistic innovation going on in many different genres.
The amount of good painters in Holland in the 17th century is kind of crazy, and the amount of good paintings produced. If you really start to look at these paintings and interpret them in the right way, a world opens.
Die Albertine an der Fifth Avenue. Das Kulturinstitut der französischen Botschaft ist einer der schönsten Orte in New York. Auch der Investor Thomas Kaplan schaut gern hier vorbei, wenn er in der Stadt ist. Denn Frankreich ist Kaplans zweite Heimat.
It has been such a long time. I am so thrilled to see you.
Thomas Kaplan besitzt eine der weltweit größten Sammlungen niederländischer Meister. Von Rubens bis zu Vermeer ist alles dabei. Sein ganzer Stolz aber sind 19 Werke von Rembrandt.
We don't have so many examples of art that one can point to having an enduring, transcendent impact. Rembrandt had that impact, still does.
Die Kunstsammlung des Amerikaners funktioniert wie eine Bibliothek. Den Großteil der Zeit ist sie in internationalen Museen zu sehen. Zum Beispiel im Pariser Louvre oder in der Petersburger Eremitage. Die Leiden Collection hat Thomas Kaplan gemeinsam mit seiner Frau anonym zusammengetragen.
The old masters had become such a niche within the art world that even as we were acquiring a painting a day for 5 years, over 200 paintings, we were still unknown in the broader art world. You'd never see our names in the media, and we love that. But it also fit very much into the ethos of our plan for the collection, which was we did not want to live with the paintings. We felt that we were on a mission to take them from the private domain and return them, in a sense, not that they were ever there originally, into the public domain.
Die Werke erzählen von einer Zeit, die unser heutiges Verständnis von Bildern als Kunst- und Handelsware prägte. Und von einem Jahrhundert, das vielen als Geburtsstunde des modernen Kunstmarkts gilt. Keimzelle dieser Entwicklungen waren Städte wie Delft, Haarlem und Amsterdam. Hier im Rijksmuseum hängt eine der umfangreichsten Sammlungen der Epoche. Sie zeigt, dem 80-jährigen Krieg, in dem die Niederlande sich von der spanischen Herrschaft lösten, verdanken wir eine kunsthistorische Revolution.
There is an influx of really very much talent. Artistic, but also wealthy merchants who dare to do things. So that's important. And they bring also a kind of taste with them. The North is really around 1600 provincial in comparison with the south. There it had Antwerp, there everything happened in the 16th century. And that comes all to the north in Haarlem, in Amsterdam, and finds a fertile ground here.
Die Niederlande waren aus dem Widerstand gegen religiöse Unterdrückung entstanden. Ihren Bürgern gewährte man daher Religionsfreiheit. Das sprach sich herum und zog Protestanten, Juden und religiös Verfolgte aus vielen Ländern an. Vor allem aus den spanisch besetzten Südprovinzen, dem heutigen Belgien. Unter ihnen viele Maler. Sie sorgten für künstlerische Innovation.
They changed it all. All the genres, landscape, still life, portraits, church interiors. They try to find their own niche with a kind of own style or own subject. And that's what the art world then makes extremely lively.
Im 17. Jahrhundert wurden Millionen von Kunstwerken produziert. Viele renommierte Museen nennen deshalb einen Schatz aus dieser Zeit ihr eigen. Doch weshalb konnte gerade in den Niederlanden eine solche Kunstfabrik entstehen?
Der Adel zum Beispiel hat an Bedeutung verloren, auch der Klerus hat an Bedeutung verloren. Und das hat das Bürgertum, die Kaufleute sind zu Geld gekommen und konnten sich auf einmal auch Kunst leisten. Also es hat einen Wandel in der Gesellschaft gegeben, der eben mit vor allen Dingen auch politischen Hintergründen zu tun hat und hatte. Und der sich aber eben auf die Kunst auswirkte und auf die Künstler auswirkte. Und das macht eben diese Gesellschaft so besonders in den Niederlanden.
Ein Grund für die kulturelle Blütezeit und ihre Bilderschwämme war der enorme Überhang an Kapital. Erwirtschaftet wurde es durch spekulative und riskante Geldgeschäfte, Seefahrt und Handel. Kapital, das von der wohlhabenden Bevölkerung möglichst nutzbringend angelegt werden musste.
Die Niederlande zeichnen sich ja aus als große Seemacht. Das ist ja auch sehr, sehr wichtig, als Handelsmacht quasi. Und erlangten so eben auch auf dem Finanzsektor eine wahnsinnig große Bedeutung, was eben für dieses kleine Land wirklich herausragend ist. Und alleine 1601 wurde die Ostindische Kompanie gegründet, 1621 die Westindische Kompanie. Man hat Handel getrieben mit Asien, mit Südamerika, mit Westafrika.
Als Kolonialmacht häuften die Niederlande Reichtum an, der auf Sklavenhandel und der Ausbeutung der Menschen in den Kolonien beruhte. Doch danach fragten damals nur wenige. Was in Übersee geschah, war weit weg. In Amsterdam genoss man lieber seinen Wohlstand und expandierte.
Und wenn man überlegt, dass zum Beispiel 1620 in Amsterdam rund 100.000 Bewohner lebten und 50 Jahre später schon doppelt so viele, dann kann man ermessen, wie viele potente Menschen eben auch in diesen Teil kamen, in diese nördlichen Niederlande kamen und eben auch dann für die Blüte auch sorgten.
Zu diesen potenten Menschen gehörten viele reiche Kaufleute und Patrizier. Unter ihnen auch die Familie von Jan Six. Als Mäzen und Freund des berühmtesten Malers der Epoche, Rembrandt van Rijn, wurde er im Laufe der Jahre mehrfach von dem großen Künstler porträtiert. Fast 500 Jahre später ist es sein Nachfahre Jan Six XI., der als Kunsthändler mit Werken von Rembrandt und seinen Zeitgenossen handelt.
Rembrandt got introduced to the family roughly around the early 1640s. And Rembrandt was by then really, a big rock star. I mean, he was on the top of his career. He painted the richest people of Amsterdam, and in the highest elite regions he was known.
Rembrandt malte zahlreiche Auftragsarbeiten. Von seinem Mäzen Jan Six schuf er ein Porträt, das wegen der meisterhaften Darstellung von dessen Innenleben als eines seiner Meisterwerke gilt. Was hat die zwei Männer so verbunden, dass ihm das gelang?
I'm still not really 100% sure what it was, because we don't have a little note saying, "Dear Rembrandt, you know, what a wonderful lunch. We are kindred spirits." We just don't know. What we do know is that at a certain moment in 1642, to very early onwards when they met each other, Jan Six apparently gave his friendship book, his album Amicorum, to Rembrandt, and he said, "Can you do something for me?" And Rembrandt made a wonderful drawing of Homer telling his verses to all the people around him. And then underneath it says, "Rembrandt to Jan Six." And of course that's interesting because he could have wrote to Mr. Six, or he could have just wrote Rembrandt. But he makes the distinct notation of Rembrandt to Jan Six. He puts them on equal par. And there are several other moments where their lives crossed. So there must have been more between the two that made the connection.
Jan Six XI. Begann als Teenager, sich mit den Werken des 17. Jahrhunderts zu beschäftigen. Und findet bis heute, zu viel Ehrfurcht haben sollte man nicht.
I remember being very young and finding all these family portraits looking at you because they follow you everywhere you go, quite scary. And I just overcame that by really looking at them, trying to understand that they were not owning me, but I was actually owning them by trying to understand them.
Auch der Kunstsammler Thomas Kaplan hat schon früh versucht, die alten Meister zu verstehen.
When I was 6 years old, my mother took me for the first time to the Metropolitan Museum. And I remember going up those steps. And I certainly remember the impact that connecting with Rembrandt had on me. It clicked. And I asked my mother continuously, every week, "Please take me back to see Rembrandt."
Inzwischen kann der Investor insgesamt 19 Werke des Künstlers sein eigen nennen. So viel wie sonst niemand auf der Welt.
I remember a week in which I acquired 2 paintings by Rembrandt for less than one Andy Warhol that went to auction. This is discordant. If you ask me why that could happen, I would have to look no further than myself. I did not know until 2003 that one could acquire a Rembrandt.
So wie Thomas Kaplan geht es vielen Kunstinteressierten. Doch nach und nach beginnen immer mehr von ihnen, die Auktionen alter Meister zu besuchen, in der Hoffnung, dort ein paar Schätze für ihre Sammlungen zu entdecken.
We definitely see an upcoming market, also a lot of new young collectors and young not in their 20s, but say starting from 40 and not as it used to be say 10 years ago, starting from their 50s or 60s. So it's becoming younger, it's becoming more popular.
We shall begin with the first lot of 5, lot number 1, by the renowned old master Rembrandt.
Die Kunstwerke der alten Meister halten Außenstehende oft für unerschwinglich. Doch der Besuch einer Auktion zeigt, manchmal kann auch ein Normalsterblicher einen echten Rembrandt mit nach Hause nehmen.
I will need to know now, going once, at 11,000, twice, and it is sold to you. Thank you very much.
If you look at graphic works, and especially when they come from such productive artists such as Rembrandt, the amounts that have been made throughout the years or even throughout the centuries in the case of Rembrandt are so extensive. It definitely, the price will be a lot higher if you have a first state of an etching made by Rembrandt himself than if you would have a 20th century copy of the original etching plate made by Rembrandt but printed 3 centuries later. But that is also something which is really nice because it also means that the art is available actually for everybody.
Wer heute mit den alten Meistern handeln, sie sammeln, sie verstehen will, muss tief in die Geschichte der Niederlande und ihrer Kunst eintauchen und wird feststellen, dass alle Wege zu ihm zurückführen. Rembrandt van Rijn, der in der Amsterdamer Jodenbrettstraat Werke für die Ewigkeit schuf.
This is the place where he created, in almost 20 years, many of his greatest masterpieces. The interesting thing about this room is the fact that it has northern light. So the lightfall was very important for him as an artist. And we also know from drawings that Rembrandt made how the room was furnished and what kind of props and materials he used.
Von seinen Zeitgenossen hob Rembrandt sich ab, weil er vom Kunstmarkt profitierte, sich aber nicht vereinnahmen ließ. Er begann, weniger Auftragsarbeiten zu übernehmen, malte lieber für Mäzene, die ihm künstlerische Freiheit ließen. So wie Jan Six. Rembrandt wollte frei sein. Man kann ihn daher als ersten modernen Künstler sehen.
He was also a collector of all kinds of interesting objects that of course arrived here at the harbor of Amsterdam from all over the world. He was very interested in what we would call exotic objects, stuffed animals, corals, shells, weapons, and he created a small museum for himself, and he was one of the first artists to collect in this fashion, and it was an inspiration for him. Some of the works he collected, some of the objects, he used them in his paintings, in his work, and others were just an inspiration for his creativity as an artist.
Im Erdgeschoss seines Wohnhauses etablierte Rembrandt einen eigenen Kunsthandel, zusammen mit seiner Frau Saskia. Wer damals von außerhalb der Stadt anreiste, um Bilder zu erwerben, so wird gemutmaßt, durfte wohl zwischen den Gemälden übernachten.
He created this fantastic business model that was, his own artwork. He also had many pupils here who paid quite a sum as a fee to be taught by Rembrandt to paint and to draw and to etch. But he also was an art dealer, so he sold his own work, of course, but also work by contemporaries, by older artists, and by his pupils. So he had all these different aspects of a business, and that really makes him a very interesting businessman.
Heute steht nur noch selten ein Rembrandt zum Verkauf. Denn nur ein Bruchteil seiner Gemälde sind noch in Privatbesitz. Der Rest hängt in den Museen, wird wohl niemals veräußert. Die Nachfrage ist deshalb groß.
We had a painting that we sold this year in a sale in New York, and it was a small Rembrandt. It was this size, one of the smallest Rembrandt in existence, and it was painted just after he went through a very turbulent period in 1640. So you try and see the brush stroke, you can see the light, and the way he tries to create a scene which we all know. It was Abram and the angels, but he puts a different sort of perspective to it, and we all tried to sort of grasp his spirit and the way he wanted to enhance the story with his sort of magic. But I'm not sure if he viewed it himself like that, but we all want to be close to that sort of virtuoso spirit of him.
Bei Sotheby's kam 2003 auch Rembrandts Selbstporträt mit verschatteten Augen unter den Hammer. Für über 11 Millionen Dollar.
It's the self-portrait of 1634 and the signature is here. But when this portrait came in with us, it actually looked quite different. It looked like this. So you will see actually that, the whole clothing has changed. In the faces has changed. The sum is still the same. But more interesting even, from 1935, the picture looked like this. So with a very big head, with long hair, with the same fur color. Then they removed the head and a bit of the long hair, and it looked like this. This is around 1966. And then we had it cleaned by a very good restorer, together with the technical data they researched with an X-ray. And then, this was revealed. The fur color, there's another fur color, not with the golden chain. The whole face changed, and it turned out to be a self-portrait by Rembrandt. But it was painted over in the 17th century, so the restorer had to remove 17th century paint from 17th century paint, and that must be painstakingly difficult to do that. You have to use a scalpel, and he's very experienced, but he could only do a few centimeters a day. It's amazing what can happen to a painting which looks totally different in the beginning. So we should be careful with this sort of paintings.
Seit 2008 ist das Selbstporträt Teil von Thomas Kaplans Sammlung. Und wie alle seine Rembrandts als Leihgabe ständig unterwegs. Wenn die Gemälde einmal nicht verliehen sind, was fast nie vorkommt, werden sie in Sicherheitslagern ein paar Stunden außerhalb von New York aufbewahrt. Besuch ist dort nicht erlaubt. Für Thomas Kaplan allerdings macht man eine Ausnahme, denn der Sammler hat manche Bilder jahrelang nicht mehr gesehen.
Wow! It really captures you right from the... My God, it's like being back with old friends. She was my first. You always remember your first. She was the one I actually kissed on the lips. That's the truth. Here, if you look, you have a doctor presumably taking rocks from the patient's head. And if you look closely at the painting, if you look at his face, you feel the pain. He's in agony. He broke the mold in the conception of what beauty was. He put aside all of the classical Italianate conventions and expressed his own sense of beauty. And he did this without inhibition. So whether it was intended or not, by breaking all conventions, he was a liberator. And all those who followed owe that debt of gratitude to Rembrandt. That's why I think he is so transcendent.
Das Herzstück von Kaplans Sammlung ist ein Ölgemälde von 1633 und nur wenige Zentimeter groß. Rembrandts Büste eines bärtigen alten Mannes.
I could stay here for an hour just doing this. This is my holy grail. It is the smallest painting by Rembrandt. I thought that I was looking at the face of God. And I thought that it was one of the most beautiful objects that I'd ever seen in my life. This case was made for it by one of its earlier owners, and apparently took it with him everywhere he traveled so that he could put it on his end table and he could live with it. There was something about the painting which, as someone who was obsessed and is obsessed with the painting, I perfectly understand, that he did not want to part with it. When you look at the way that he paints the hair, the forehead, the beard, the everything, it is as close to perfection as anything that I've ever seen. It's an absolute gem.
Einen Schatz hat auch der Kunsthändler Jan Six gehoben. 2016 hat er den ersten, völlig unbekannten Rembrandt seit 40 Jahren entdeckt. Dank intensiver Recherche, ziemlich harter Ellenbogen und eines guten Blicks ist er der Konkurrenz dabei knapp zuvorgekommen.
I think the most important thing to realize when you look at a work of art is that for some reason, 400 years or so, people have mislooked at that picture. They misinterpreted the picture. Because that's the only reason that it's not in a big museum or it's not placed in the right context. So something is wrong. And we tend to call that a sleeper. The painting is actually sleeping. So what you need to do first is to acknowledge that. Don't follow what the general feel is. I believe you have this concept of the Neinsager and the Ja-Sager. So if you always say no, it's not by Rembrandt because, you're never going to discover anything. If you say, yeah, it might be by Rembrandt, you're not saying it is, but you leave the option open to think out of the box and to be more positive about it, you have a very good chance that somehow, somewhere, you will discover a potential Rembrandt.
Händler wie Six beschäftigen sich über Jahre intensiv mit einem Bild in der Hoffnung, dass Rembrandt-Forscher dessen Echtheit anerkennen. Am Ende entscheidet die Wissenschaft über eine oft intuitive Entdeckung.
If you look at a portrait by Rembrandt, always the person who is portrayed is looking at you, instead of you looking at the person. It's this uneasy feeling if somebody is looking at you. And if you turn your gaze away, you feel, hey, somebody's still looking at me. This is slightly unsettling. That is sort of how I can explain it with portraits. Once you see it, it hits you. And so there must be an immediate contact. That's one, that's sort of the stomach feeling concept.
Six' Bauchgefühl meldete sich auch, als er in einer Auktion das Porträt eines jungen Mannes sah. Ausgewiesen als ein Werk aus Rembrandts Umkreis.
I looked at that painting and immediately thought, hang on, this is much better than the auction house is telling us. And the moment that really made the click for me was a technical problem. This portrait shows a young man wearing a very distinct piece of lace work. And that lace came into fashion at a very distinct time. So the painting can't be before 1631 or 32. And then with fashion, it's exactly the same as nowadays. Fashion counts for young people. It doesn't count for old people. But in this case, you see a very young boy. You know, he literally doesn't really have a mustache or a beard. I mean, his cheeks are so pinkish, he's real young. And so he's wearing this lace. The auction house presented it as a painting from the circle of Rembrandt. Well, If you look at the fashion, that was just not possible, because the fashion with the young boy, it had to be between 1631-2 and 1634-5 tops. But most likely around 33-34. It's that distinct. Now Rembrandt at that time, he didn't have a circle.
Ein Investor, der von Jan Six beraten wurde, hat das Gemälde damals für 137.000 Pfund ersteigert. Heute ist es als echter Rembrandt bestätigt und ein Vielfaches wert. Porträts waren für Rembrandt oft ein Brot- und Buttergeschäft. Auftragsarbeiten für das vermögende Bürgertum. Der Adel hingegen favorisierte die Historienmalerei.
In der Hierarchie war tatsächlich immer die Historie, die biblische Historie auch an oberster Stelle. Und danach folgte so langsam dann im 17. Jahrhundert in den Niederlanden folgten die Landschaften, die Landschaftsmalerei war auf dem Vormarsch, muss man sagen. Und dann kamen die Porträts und dann irgendwann tatsächlich die Genremalerei.
Genrebilder waren Darstellungen von profanen, alltäglichen Szenen. Gesammelt wurden sie vor allem von den unteren Schichten, die sie auf Märkten und in Lotterien kauften. Die Genremalerei war beim Volk sehr beliebt. Nur das Ausland wunderte sich über den Geschmack der Niederländer.
Sie waren schockiert tatsächlich und haben sich über die Hässlichkeit der Darstellungen mokiert und erhaben und haben eben festgestellt, wie hässlich also wirklich hässlich, diese Figuren in den Szenen aussehen. Das war tatsächlich eigentlich was Unerhörtes, dass man auch den Menschen eben in diesen ja zum Teil übertriebenen Szenen, wenn die eben dann trinken oder rauften, also bei den Ausschweifungen ihres Lebens quasi zusehen konnte, wurde schon als ungehörig auf jeden Fall empfunden. Und das ist schon neu, dass man so unverblümt Emotionen, Gefühle, Affekte darstellt.
Genrebilder hatten auch eine erzieherische Funktion. Schaut her, so sieht es aus, wenn ihr euch gehen lasst, scheinen die Gemälde zu höhnen. Heute schenken Museumsbesucher den Werken eher weniger Beachtung. Anders als diesem repräsentativen Großformat. Rembrandts Nachtwache ist ein Besuchermagnet und gilt als das wertvollste Bild der Niederlande. Auch deshalb wird es jetzt aufwendig untersucht.
What becomes more and more aware is that we thought a little bit, and after painting has been painted, it's over. Nothing changes. But of course, there are all kind of chemical reactions going on, and this will continue always. So paint will change in color, things will bloop out, or this is a little bit extreme, but painting is a living material, or at least things happen. It's extremely difficult if you want to paint 20 or 30 people in one group without becoming stiff. So he solves it with bringing a kind of movement in it. They are really, well, they seem to walk out of the canvas in one way, and that's of course brilliant. The first group portraits started in the early 17th century. And in 1942 he solves the problem, and nobody ever got that level, I think.
Nur aus sich selbst geschöpft hat Rembrandt nicht. Die Künstler in Holland beobachteten einander genau, pflegten eine lebhafte Konkurrenz. Was sein Kollege Frans Hals in Haarlem trieb, hat der Maler sicher gewusst.
Rembrandt looked at the Magere Compagnie as a source of inspiration for his Nachtwacht. Very difficult to substantiate, but we love to believe that.
Fest steht, Frans Hals schuf als erster Künstler, noch vor Rembrandt, großformatige Auftragsarbeiten für die Bewohner seiner Heimatstadt.
One of the most impressive parts of Frans Hals's oeuvre are group portraits of civic guards. Nowadays there were a kind of civilian police, a bit of crossover between the civilian police and the Rotary Club. It was part of your status, because in order to get the uniform and the equipment you had to pay. So you need to have a certain amount of money in order to be part of that civic guard. So it was a big boys' club meant to safeguard peace in the city. And the group portraits of Frans Hals of the civic guard are incredibly lively. We see them at parties, or if they're posing, it's a bit messy. They look at each other, it's quite chaotic. It's again this idea of taking the moment as if he had a camera and could just fixate a brief moment of interaction. And in that sense, they're a beautiful rendering of a certain strata of society at that time, but you also catch interaction between people, and you see hierarchies, you see party atmosphere, you see something going on.
Frans Hals war schon zu Lebzeiten über die Grenzen Hollands hinaus bekannt. Trotz seines Ruhms und zahlungskräftiger Auftraggeber hatte er Zeit seines Lebens mit Geldproblemen zu kämpfen. Hinterlassen hat er nichts, außer seinem beeindruckenden Gesamtwerk.
Frans Hals is certainly the first who showed the loose brushstroke, but he is a little bit separate. He finds something and he folds it, he develops it all his life. And that is, I think he wanted to paint a kind of movement and dynamism. He wants to paint life.
Wie so oft in der Geschichte der Kunst wurde auch der Wert von Frans Hals Gemälden im Verlauf der Jahrhunderte am Zeitgeschmack gemessen.
One of the Frans Hals paintings I very much cherish is the Regentesses of the St. Elizabeth Hospital. And it's one of the latest portraits that Frans Hals has painted. He was probably in his 80s, so almost it's geriatric, even especially for the 17th century, that was unusually old. And what I love about the painting is that it's out of time. It doesn't fit with the 17th century. And at the same time, I also love the fact that it was both hated and cherished all throughout history. In the 18th century, you see in all literature that this painting was seen as absolute garbage, as the proof of the fact that Frans Hals, when he was old, had no control over his hand, and he was probably shaking, that him suggested that he had Alzheimer, that he didn't know how to paint anymore. That had a lot to do with the 18th century focus on the academic. No, painting needed to be precise according to the rules, and this was different. So it was really shoved aside. You see market prices of Frans Hals at the time also going down. It was not appreciated. And then suddenly everything shifts around at the end of the 19th century, because French collector and critic Thoré Burger, together with a large group of artists that he incited from Van Gogh to Manet, Monet, Singer Sargent, Mary Cassatt, Whistler, started loving this painting by Frans Hals. They said, it's an icon. You know, this is the proof that Frans Hals was an avant-garde painter. He was ultimately modern. He was ahead of his time. He paints like we do, realist impressionists. He had something extraordinary. And this painting was then seen as the absolute proof because of its loose brushstroke, its use of color in its dimensions of black. So it's amazing how one painting that basically stays the same goes through all these stages of being valued and appreciated, but also of being absolutely discarded. We're lucky that it's still here, because I think if it wouldn't have been in a semi-public institution in the 18th century, it would probably have disappeared.
Das Gros der niederländischen Kunst des 17. Jahrhunderts existiert nicht mehr. Doch Sammler, Händler und Experten hoffen weiterhin, dass irgendwo noch ein Frans Hals oder Rembrandt überdauert hat.
We come to people's collections, people's houses, castles, and we have to do inventories. And sometimes you go into a house and there's an old inventory and things are not on it or are on it or have been miscatalogued or not catalogued. And I love just go into a house or a castle or wherever and put the right name on it. Even sometimes I can't find it, but I discuss with colleagues or I try to do some research, but you discover who is who, or even a small artist, and I look in bathrooms, I look in kitchens, I look above the door, because you never know what you're going to find. Around 10 million paintings were probably made, of which we now only have, they estimated 5% left because of the, I think got lost, got burned, destroyed, whatever happened.
Einer, von dem nur wenige Werke erhalten sind, ist Jan Vermeer. Sein Œuvre ist ungewöhnlich klein, wenn man es mit Kollegen wie Rembrandt vergleicht, der über 300 Bilder malte.
Vermeer is an interesting example because we do think that he didn't paint so much because he took very long to prepare the pigments for his paintings, to paint. Then he didn't have to paint for the money because he was married to a very rich wife. And we believe actually he painted, well, if we look at his oeuvre now, I think there are around 37 accepted Vermeers, that he probably painted just one a year. But of course we're not sure because we weren't there. And he didn't post his work on Instagram at the time.
Jan Vermeer konnte bereits zu Lebzeiten hohe Preise für seine wenigen, detailreichen Gemälde erzielen, die er an wohlhabende Mäzene in Delft und Den Haag verkaufte.
If we look at Netherlandish painting, we talk about the Trinity. You have Rembrandt, Vermeer, Frans Hals, the three big boys, no? That we still remember today. And if you look at the oeuvre of Vermeer, that's very mysterious. It's very intimate. It's very difficult to understand what the symbolical meaning was, what the intention was. It's very domestic.
Vermeer war nicht nur Maler, sondern auch als Kunsthändler tätig. Trotz seines Talents für prachtvolle Interieurszenen und seiner ausgewiesenen Expertise verarmte er am Ende seines Lebens. 1667 ging er bankrott.
Wenn man sich überlegt, welche Szene er dargestellt hat, eben auch diese jungen Frauen am offenen Fenster, oft im Profil gezeigt, die ja lesen, so ein bisschen in sich gekehrt sind. Das sind ja sehr ruhige Szenen auch, sehr, ja, die haben fast was Kontemplatives irgendwie. Und diese aber wirklich hocheleganten Kleider, er hat auch detailliert immer die Stoffe der Kleider ausgearbeitet. Er hat detailliert auch die Frisuren ausgearbeitet, den Schmuck. Und da sieht man wirklich nochmal den ganzen Reichtum eigentlich des 17. Jahrhunderts.
Viele der Vermeers sind heute im Rijksmuseum zu sehen. Unter ihnen auch dieses Bild. Die Milchmagd. Sie brachte bereits damals bei Vermeers Nachlassversteigerung den stolzen Preis von 175 Gulden ein. Heute wäre sie bei einer Auktion unbezahlbar.
With the milkmaid, it's the combination of, I guess, the colors, which really are lovely, and the way that Vermeer puts a milkmaid in the center of the painting. It's so you're looking at not of a portrait of a noble person or an important person. It's a milkmaid, and there's such softness and sweetness, and has this wonderful structure. And I think Vermeer is a very special painter because he was really, out of the ordinary, one of a kind.
In gewisser Weise kann man das 17. Jahrhundert als Ursprung unseres Kunstsystems sehen, denn damals entstand das Fundament für eine Kunstwelt, wie wir sie heute kennen.
All right, we're in the gallery space here. This is his 17th century house. It very looks like a room where Vermeer used to work in the 17th century, with the marble floors and the high ceilings. You can imagine Vermeer working here on his easel.
Im 17. Jahrhundert öffneten die Auktionshäuser ihre Türen, der Beruf des Kunsthändlers und die bürgerliche Sammlerschicht entstanden. Die Kunst demokratisierte sich. Ein Einfluss, der noch heute spürbar ist.
we furnished it with art as well. So, I mean, there is a connection, or we feel there is a connection between 17th century and art now. You're standing on the shoulders of giants. That's what they always say in art, you know. So, of course, we know about our heritage.
Das gilt auch für die Künstler, die heute in Holland leben. Sie müssen sich an den Meistern des 17. Jahrhunderts messen lassen, sich von ihnen abgrenzen, ihre eigene Handschrift entwickeln, aber sich dennoch von der Technik und den Tricks der Vorgänger inspirieren lassen.
It's not to hit the sitter if they fall asleep, but it's a maul stick. If you have to paint something very detailed, you use this to lean on to get a steady hand. Because if you paint something very small in detail, you can get shaky, but you use this as steady hand. And a nice painting where you can see how it was used is the beautiful Vermeer painting in Vienna in the Kunsthistorisches, where you see painting from the back, leaning his hand against the maul stick to paint a small detail.
Für den schwedischen Maler Urban Larsson ist die niederländische Kunst des 17. Jahrhunderts eine wichtige Referenz.
I think the similarity between how I work and 17th century master's work is, I mean, there are several things. One is I work from life. Another thing is also, using northern light. I only work with daylight because I don't believe that a lamp can give the same sort of effect as daylight. And the materials are in a way quite similar.
Dem 17. Jahrhundert verdanken Maler wie Larsson eine wichtige Innovation. Zum ersten Mal in der Kunstgeschichte wurde das Seelenleben der Modelle auf die Leinwand gebracht. Bis heute gilt das als wichtiges Kriterium dafür, was aus einem Auftragsporträt ein Kunstwerk macht.
Portrait painting is like walking on a tightrope, on this line above a huge downfall. You have to use your intuition. You just have to let go at the same time as you have to really think about every stroke, everything you put down on the canvas. And I think when you use this intuition and when you really get into it, that's the part where the character or the personality or the spirit, where it goes beyond just likeness. And that happens in the process if you are emotionally and completely into it.
Niemand konnte das so gut wie Rembrandt. Deshalb sind seine Porträts so wertvoll. Diese zwei mussten Louvre und Rijksmuseum zusammen erwerben. 160 Millionen Euro legten sie für Marten und Oppien auf den Tisch. Dabei muss man das Ehepaar und seine Vorfahren kritisch betrachten.
They are symbols of the Dutch Republic. They are wealthy, they are young, they show that they love each other, they bring a new vibrancy, and that was shown. And we tend to forget where the wealth came from, but the wealth came from slavery, from a lot of trade in weapons and so on, and colonialism. And it's good to be aware of those things. And those paintings do change, or at least we look differently at them in one way. And we look differently at that age, and that's important.
Wie man mit der Kunst des sogenannten Goldenen Zeitalters und seiner Schattenseite heute umgehen muss, wird derzeit lebhaft diskutiert. Aber auch, inwiefern Künstler wie Rembrandt davon profitierten. Die Meinungen gehen auseinander. Einig ist man sich nur, dass es eine Blütezeit wie diese kein zweites Mal gab. Eine Blütezeit, die naturgemäß ein Ende fand, finden musste. 17. Jahrhundert. 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 17.
1672 is the rampjaar, disaster year. So then the Dutch Republic is attacked by the English, by the French, by the Germans from all sides. So it's really it's a narrow escape really for the Dutch Republic. They're almost gone, and after that the economy has to, well, they revive in one way, and still in the 18th century it's still a very rich country, but yeah, as said, it misses a kind of vibrancy or something. It's still there, it's still rich, but and certainly England and France, they are the real world powers then, and the Netherlands, it's not anymore. It's back to where it belongs more or less. It's really a very small country.
But you have to understand that Holland was at that time so wealthy, so incredibly wealthy by all the wealth they amassed in that whole century before, that they didn't have to do a lot. They were actually retired, so to speak. And it starts to change in the middle of the 18th century, where the fortunes are diminishing because they're doing nothing, they're just spending. And then around 1750s, 1760s, they have to sell.
Auch ihre Kunst, die sich im Verlauf der folgenden Jahrhunderte über die ganze Welt verteilte und dort blieb. Heute findet nur noch ab und an eines der Gemälde den Weg in seine Heimat zurück.
I thought to myself, I'm not 100% sure what it is, but the whole build-up and the approach is very much like Rembrandt would used to work. So I decided to do a lot of research, and for the last 1.5, 2 years I've been trying to place everything together to see if that could actually work, if this could actually fit within the oeuvre of Rembrandt. And Rembrandt has a quite distinct methodology, and you can see this in little details. The way he uses the ground tone for shadow areas, or how he builds up the shadow part of a face with the reflection of something that is reflected back to the shadow. All these little details, I'm looking at them, thinking about them, and that might eventually lead to a hypothesis to try to prove that this is actually by Rembrandt. Because again, this lady is looking at us. We're trying to look at her, but she is really making contact with you. And that is very, very rare in portraiture. So, maybe one day.
In nicht allzu ferner Zukunft ist schon der nächste bisher unentdeckte Rembrandt dabei.